Forget to record. We've still got people piling in, so we'll give that a minute yet for folks to, we're just straight up on the hour. So thank you to everyone who managed to join us on this very snowy day. We appreciate folks making this happen. We are, as you just heard, going to record the webinar so that it will be available for folks who couldn't make it today. I'm Kathy Kuntz. I'm with the Dane County Office of Energy and Climate Change, and I'm delighted that we've got a strong turnout today for this really important discussion. So with me today is Bill Holloway, a transportation planner at Greater Madison MPO. And some of you know that Bill and the MPO have been working on an analysis for more than a year now to look at EV charging infrastructure across Dane County and assess the gaps. And so Bill is going to share that draft report with us. There is still time to have comments on the draft report until later this month. So that's our intent, is to get that information out a bit here. Bill is going to take it from here. We're going to have folks put their questions in the chat as we go, and then we will respond to those at the end. But if you think you're going to forget your question, go ahead and stick it in the chat, and then we'll circle back to it at the end. So, Bill, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Kathy. I'm going to share my screen here. So, Kathy, is it showing up right for you?
It is perfect. Thanks.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Today, I'm going to discuss the draft Dane County Electric Vehicle, or EV charging infrastructure plan. And we've got a lot of material to cover. So as Kathy mentioned, please hold your questions until the end of the presentation. In 2022, the MPO decided to begin work on a plan to help local governments understand and adjust to the ongoing shift towards electric vehicles. To help define the purpose and the scope of the plan, and to better understand the current state of EV infrastructure in our region, we convened a steering committee made up of representatives from state and local government, energy utilities, and nonprofit organizations. The goal of the plan is to help communities in Dane County prepare for the shift towards EVs and provide them with the foundational information needed to secure grant funding. To meet these goals, the plan provides an overview of trends in EV ownership and charging, best practices to ensure sufficient charging infrastructure, high priority locations for public charging infrastructure, and available grant opportunities. There are three main types of electric vehicles available today. Battery electric vehicles, which are entirely electric and which are plugged in to charge. Plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, which have both a combustion engine and an electric motor and are plugged in to charge. And hybrid electric vehicles, which also have a combustion engine and an electric motor, but which charge their batteries during driving and braking rather than by plugging in. This plan focuses on the charging infrastructure used by battery electric and plug-in hybrid vehicles. While EVs offer numerous benefits in terms of performance and convenience, the most important benefits of EVs from a societal perspective are in the areas of public health, environmental sustainability, and the economy. This chart shows the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions of a mid-sized passenger car powered using different types of fuels. The two columns in the red box show the life cycle emissions of EVs, with the shortest column reflecting the life cycle emissions of an EV that is exclusively charged using renewable energy. Beyond greenhouse gases, a shift towards EVs can also reduce direct tailpipe emissions that harm human health. Nitrogen oxides, carbon monoxide, and volatile organic compounds, as well as secondary pollutants, such as ozone and fine particulate matter, or PM 2.5, that form in the atmosphere following emissions of their precursor chemicals. However, it's important to remember that tailpipes are not the only source of vehicle emissions. Dust particles from brake pads and tires are a growing share of on-road PM 2.5 emissions. Unlike tailpipe emissions, this dust is unregulated and in some locations may represent a larger public health hazard than tailpipe emissions. While the regenerative braking used by EVs results in lower emissions of brake dust compared to conventional vehicles, tire dust emissions from EVs can exceed conventional vehicles due to their heavier weight, which increases tire wear and stirs up more dust that is settled on the pavement. Fuel costs for EVs are generally less than half of that of similar fossil-fueled vehicles. In addition, without the need for oil changes and engine maintenance, EVs are cheaper to maintain. These cost advantages have been recognized by the transportation network companies Uber and Lyft. Both plan to have 100% of their drivers using EVs by 2030. Ride-hailing drivers are already shifting to EVs in large numbers to reduce their fuel and maintenance costs. According to Uber, its drivers in the US were using EVs at 8 times the rate of the general public as of the third quarter of 2022. Because of their larger fuel expenses, rural drivers who tend to drive longer distances than people in urban areas, and who often drive pickup trucks and other large vehicles, stand to reap outsized benefits from shifting to EVs. The larger EVs now coming to market, particularly electric pickup trucks, will allow increasing numbers of rural drivers to transition to EVs. And the public health benefits of electric vehicles will also resonate in the economy. The growing share of EVs on the road in Dane County and the resulting air quality improvements will reduce cardiovascular and respiratory illnesses such as asthma and heart attacks. These improvements in community health will reduce healthcare expenses, visits to the doctor's office and ER, and the number of school and work days lost to illness, all of which save money for families and improve quality of life. The primary obstacles to EV uptake are vehicle cost and concerns about driving range and the speed and availability of charging infrastructure. While the purchase price of EVs is roughly 25% higher than equivalent conventional vehicles, analyses suggest that their lower fueling and maintenance expenses give them a lower total cost of ownership after about 5 or 6 years. Range anxiety, the concern that drivers will find themselves stranded with an empty battery, and related concerns regarding the availability of charging infrastructure and charging speeds are another major impediment to broader EV adoption. Overcoming these obstacles requires education to help the public more accurately gauge their true range requirements and charging needs. In actuality, Americans drive an average of fewer than 40 miles per day, far less than the range of any EV on the market, and nearly 90% of EV charging is done at home. Addressing this barrier will require the continued expansion of charging infrastructure and major improvements to charging infrastructure maintenance. UC Berkeley researchers who evaluated all 181 public Level 3 fast charging stations in the Bay Area that were open for general use, excluding Tesla supercharger stations, found in a 2022 paper that less than 75% were functional. Finally, Wisconsin's statutory prohibition on factory stores, i.e. manufacturer-owned auto dealerships, presents an additional barrier. It requires Wisconsinites interested in purchasing Tesla, Rivian, and certain other types of EVs to travel out of state to do so. Before we get too deep in the presentation, I just want to go over some of the terminology. The charging port or charger provides electricity to charge one vehicle at a time. There may be more than one port on a charging post. The plug or connector is the part that plugs into an EV to charge it. And there may be more than one connector at a port, but the port can still only charge one vehicle at a time. There are 3 basic levels of charging. Level 1 is the slowest charging level, which uses a standard residential wall outlet. Level 2 is the most common type of public charging infrastructure. It requires the same 240-volt service used by refrigerators and laundry machines. Level 3, also known as direct current fast charging, requires 480-volt service. It can charge a battery electric vehicle to 80% in less than an hour, but costs far more to install than lower charging levels. Charging speed varies substantially within each charging level, according to power supply, and is also determined by other factors, including each vehicle's maximum charging speed and battery capacity. And this map shows the locations of existing level 2 and level 3 public charging sites in Dane County. This chart shows the growing number of public EV charging ports over time from the end of 2019 through the beginning of 2022. During this short period, the number of public charging ports in the US grew by about 40%. About 20% of all public charging ports are now level 3 fast chargers, and virtually all of the remainder are level 2 ports. As I mentioned, charging speeds at each charging level are dependent on power supply. This chart details the increasing power levels of level 3 chargers in the US. Federal guidelines dictate a minimum power level of 150 kilowatts for level 3 chargers that receive federal funding. Most newly constructed level 3 ports exceed this level, with some new chargers offering 350 kilowatts or more. EV charging speed is limited both by the power level of the charger and maximum charging speed of the vehicle. Many EVs on the road can accept a maximum charge of 50 kilowatts, no matter how powerful the charger. However, many newer and more expensive EVs can accept a higher powered charge. For them, more powerful chargers will allow them to charge more quickly. These are the different connector types. Non-Tesla vehicles use J1772 plugs for level 1 and 2 charging. CCS connectors are now the standard non-Tesla fast charging plug. The CHAdeMO connector is becoming less common and among new cars is only used on the Nissan Leaf. All Tesla vehicles come standard with an adapter that allows them to charge using J1772 connectors. And there are other adapters available that can allow them to charge using non-Tesla fast chargers. Non-Tesla vehicles cannot normally charge at Tesla chargers. However, Tesla has pledged to open at least 7,500 of its chargers, 3,500 of which will be level 3 fast chargers, to non-Tesla EVs by the end of the year. Tesla has already started opening some of its charging stations to non-Teslas by equipping them with Magic Dock adapters that fit cars that use CCS connectors. Last year, a number of major automakers announced that they will be adopting the Tesla connector, since renamed the North America Charging Standard, or NACS connector, on their vehicles beginning in the 2025 model year. These charts show the plug types available at public charging locations in Dane County. While the majority of level 3 charging locations are equipped with CHAdeMO and CCS plugs, about half of all level 3 ports in the county are equipped with Tesla plugs. This is because most Tesla plugs are concentrated at a small number of larger charging stations. While CHAdeMO plugs are available at many fast charging locations, they are normally outnumbered by CCS plugs. Over the coming years, the Tesla plug, now known as NACS, will become much more common. And there are 3 basic types of charging locations. Residences are by far the most important, accounting for nearly 90% of all EV charging. People who have a place to park at home where they can charge their vehicle have access to the cheapest and most convenient charging method. Unfortunately, people living in multifamily housing, many of whom are low income, often lack a place to charge their vehicles at home. This makes EV ownership more costly and less convenient. As increasing numbers of lower cost used EVs enter the market, it's important from both a social justice and sustainability perspective to increase access to residential charging for people who currently lack it. Charging infrastructure in employment areas has commonly been provided in business-owned parking lots to serve normally higher-income office workers. This is what has historically been known as workplace charging. As more lower-income people purchase EVs in the coming years, there will be a need for more charging infrastructure to serve workers in other types of occupations who may be unable to charge their vehicles at home. Much of this infrastructure will be needed in shared parking facilities in downtowns and malls, where it can serve retail and other non-office workers as well as visitors. Because workers generally leave their cars parked for at least several hours, level 2 charging is sufficient. Corridor and community charging encompasses all other locations. Community charging includes charging infrastructure and parking facilities serving commercial areas, libraries, parks, and other community destinations. Corridor charging consists of chargers located at intervals along highways to facilitate long-distance travel by EVs. In locations where visitors are expected to spend more than an hour or so, level 2 charging is often sufficient. Level 3 chargers are needed to serve travelers making quick stops on long-distance trips and for ride-hail and delivery drivers that need to refuel during their work shifts. Now I'm going to run through some of the additional considerations for public charging installations. Federal law generally requires that publicly owned charging facilities, as well as public EV charging stations owned by private entities, be accessible to people with disabilities. EV charging requires drivers to exit their vehicle, get the connector from the charging station, and carry the connector back to their vehicle's charging inlet. Because there's no standard location for a vehicle's charging inlet, drivers with mobility impairments need to be able to maneuver around the entire vehicle. EV charging stations should also be equipped with accessible communication features for use by people with disabilities that may interfere with their ability to use the charger interface. In Dane County, about 10% of public charging locations have at least one charging port serving an ADA accessible parking space. Public charging stations are generally owned and/or operated by private charging network companies. Even free charging stations often require a network membership to charge. Networks may process payments, track usage, and provide customer support. They may also partner with site hosts to help plan and construct the charging site, develop charging station policies, provide maintenance, or other services. Non-networked stations are not connected to the internet and cannot accept payments or offer advanced utilization monitoring. ChargePoint is the most widespread charging network in Dane County, but Tesla is the largest operator of level 3 ports. Maintenance is a huge issue, with some studies finding that more than a quarter of public chargers are inoperable. Along with regular wear and tear, one of the most common and frustrating issues cited by our steering committee members was that chargers in perfect condition are rendered inoperable if they cannot connect to their charging network due to Wi-Fi or mobile network connection problems. When problems arise, maintenance is often delayed due to a shortage of replacement parts and a lack of maintenance workers. Site owners hosting chargers who have maintenance contracts with service providers still often face delays in service or disagreements about the extent of their coverage. This has spurred the development of new dedicated EV infrastructure maintenance companies, such as Charger Help. Chargers on the Tesla network tend to have far fewer maintenance problems than those associated with other charging networks. This is likely one of the reasons that many automakers have decided to transition to the Tesla or NACS connector on their vehicles in the coming years. The above-ground elements of the charging site, the charging infrastructure, maintenance and communications contracts, and management software, typically only accounts for 10 to 30% of total project costs. The larger share of costs are due to less visible infrastructure and installation work, including trenching for conduit and wiring, electrical grid upgrades, and soft costs associated with planning and permitting. Because charging infrastructure can be installed at a relatively low cost and does not require on-site staff for operation and monitoring, it can be installed in all types of locations. As a result, it is sometimes located in dark or secluded areas. Placing charging infrastructure in visible, well-lit areas can help reduce real and perceived safety risks and the potential for vandalism. While they are very rare, fires involving EV batteries have sometimes made headlines in recent years. Although EVs are less likely to catch fire than vehicles with internal combustion engines, fires involving EV batteries burn hotter and last longer than those involving conventional vehicles. They also pose unique risks to emergency responders due to the potential for electric shock and for batteries to explode or reignite after being put out. To mitigate the risk of fires resulting from collisions, automakers have been working to reinforce battery protection. They're also exploring new types of EV batteries that may further reduce fire risk. Due to the weight of batteries, EVs often weigh hundreds or thousands of pounds more than equivalent conventional vehicles. The primary safety issue associated with these heavier vehicles is the risk they pose to other road users with each additional 1,000 pounds of vehicle weight associated with a nearly 50% increase in baseline fatality risk for occupants of other vehicles that are struck. But beyond crash risks, the greater weight of EVs may present structural issues for parking structures as well, particularly those that are old or in poor condition. The heavier weight of EVs combined with their extremely quick acceleration also increases the risk of damage to walls and structural elements of parking garages in the event a vehicle crashes inside a parking facility. There are two main types of EV charging station signage: wayfinding signage that helps people locate charging stations, and station signage that communicates information and policies. Wayfinding signage located on roadways open to the public must comply with minimum design and placement standards defined in the FHWA's Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, or MUTCD. The blue signs shown here are included in the MUTCD as approved designs. Signage at charging stations highlights the location of charging infrastructure and informs drivers of the rules governing the use of the charging infrastructure and associated parking spaces. To be enforceable, signage in the public right-of-way must meet MUTCD requirements and be supported by local ordinances. While signage is helpful in identifying charging stations to passing motorists, the most common way that EV drivers locate charging stations is through smartphone applications. EV charging apps provide drivers with charging station locations, plug types, and the charging levels available, and may also inform users about maintenance issues, charger power levels, current occupancy, or other information. Most EV manufacturers and charging networks have their own EV charging apps. Network apps may allow users to reserve chargers ahead of time, notify users when their vehicle reaches a certain charge level, or allow users to start and stop their charging sessions remotely. There are also a number of trip planning apps that help users plan charging stops along their route based on their vehicle's range and other factors. Charging infrastructure is either owned by the owner of the charging site or by a third party, often a utility or charging network operator. There are a number of different types of arrangements that entail different levels of responsibility for maintenance and operating expenses, with varying levels of financial risk and reward for site owners, with some of the most common types of arrangements shown here. Under an own and operate model, which is the most common in public sector settings, the client provides space for the provider to install and operate charging stations. The provider then takes all responsibility for operations and maintenance and keeps the revenue generated from charging fees. There are a number of ways to reduce the cost of charging infrastructure installations. Buying charging infrastructure in bulk may lower per unit costs. Consolidating charging infrastructure into a smaller number of larger charging stations can reduce costs by spreading the fixed site preparation and utility connection costs across more chargers and reducing the number of sites that maintenance personnel need to visit. Locating charging infrastructure where there's a short, simple conduit path to the utility connection can dramatically lower the cost of trenching and wiring. Equipping new charging sites with the necessary conduit, grid capacity, and other required underground infrastructure to enable higher powered chargers to be added later reduces future installation costs. And installing charging infrastructure during construction rather than later on helps to reduce design and installation costs and avoids the need to dig trenches through existing parking lots. To provide consistency to travelers and improve fairness for consumers, the federal government requires that federally funded EV charging infrastructure calculate charging fees by kilowatt hours of electricity used rather than by the time spent charging. Because different vehicles can accept vastly different levels of power from EV charging infrastructure, when charging fees are based on time rather than kilowatt hours, they pay much different rates for the power received. This discrepancy disadvantages lower-income EV drivers because older and less expensive vehicles, which usually cannot accept as fast of a charge, cost more to charge when fees are based on time rather than energy used. The difference in vehicle charging speeds is most pronounced when it comes to level 3 or DC fast charging. As shown here, some new luxury vehicles can gain 100 miles of charge in as little as 8 minutes, while other more affordable vehicles may require nearly 45 minutes for the same charge. Differences between different types of vehicles are less pronounced in the case of level 2 charging, with the fastest charging vehicles able to charge about twice as fast as the slowest. Wisconsin state law currently prohibits anyone other than utilities from charging fees based on electricity usage. EV charging stations in the state generally charge fees based on the time spent charging rather than by kilowatt hours used. The state will need to change this law to unlock federal funding for charging infrastructure. Recently, there's been movement in the state legislature to make this change. And these tables show the fee structures in Dane County. Level 2 charging is most commonly $2 an hour, and level 3 is most commonly $5 an hour. Pole-mounted chargers, charging infrastructure mounted on streetlight or utility poles, can be a flexible and low-cost way to provide on-street charging infrastructure. London, England has over 7,000 pole-mounted chargers, but the technology is still in its infancy in the US. Los Angeles currently leads the nation with over 430 chargers mounted on streetlight poles. Pole-mounted chargers can be a good way to provide access to charging to people living in places where they cannot charge at home. MG&E currently has a pilot program to test pole-mounted chargers in the Madison area. The first was installed on Madison's east side in the Darbo-Worthington neighborhood last year. As of January 2023, less than 1% of registered vehicles in Dane County were electric, but the number of EVs in the county is expected to skyrocket over the next few decades. Projections suggest that EVs will make up roughly 15% of registered vehicles in the county by 2030 and will account for somewhere between 30 and 80% by 2050. While Dane County currently exceeds the Department of Energy's recommended minimum number of public level 2 and level 3 charging ports, it will need more to meet future demand. And this map is from a recent report by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. It shows the predicted share of EVs, here abbreviated PEV, for plug-in electric vehicles. And in 2030, Madison is expected to have one of the largest shares of electric vehicles among all Midwestern cities. Ensuring adequate EV charging infrastructure to support the expected growth in the number of EVs over the coming decade will require action from both the public and private sectors. Much of the work on the public sector side will entail the use of policy and planning tools to efficiently channel private sector funding for charging infrastructure towards the locations where it is most needed. Comprehensive plans form the bedrock of local transportation and land use decision-making. Identifying EVs as a key part of local transportation strategy provides a basis for tailoring zoning and other ordinances to support the development of EV charging infrastructure. Both the Dane County Climate Action Plan and the MPO's Connect Greater Madison 2050 Regional Transportation Plan have identified transitioning to EVs as a key part of reducing emissions and slowing climate change. Zoning codes that explicitly address EV charging infrastructure reduce confusion for installers and government officials, making installation faster and more efficient. EV charging related issues that can be dealt with in the zoning code include where charging stations are permitted by right or conditionally, charging power levels allowed in different locations, requirements that parking areas be equipped with EV chargers or be ready for their future installation, site design guidelines, and incentives for installation. The cities of Madison and Verona have both adopted requirements for EV infrastructure in parking facilities. The City of Madison's policy, adopted in 2021, requires that certain new, expanded, or significantly reconstructed parking facilities must include parking spaces that are EV ready, prepared for the future installation of EV charging infrastructure, as well as parking spaces that are equipped with fully installed charging infrastructure. The requirements pertain to parking facilities with at least 6 residential parking spaces and those that provide parking in locations where people are expected to remain for more than 6 hours. As shown in the table on the left, the required percentage of EV ready and EV installed spaces increases every 5 years. The table on the right shows how the minimum number of ADA accessible parking spaces grows alongside the required number of EV installed spaces. Local parking ordinances set the terms of use for publicly accessible parking facilities, including curbside parking spaces. Because EVs need to park in order to charge, it's important to ensure that these ordinances support community EV charging goals. Municipalities can also support the expansion of EV charging infrastructure by siting charging infrastructure in municipal parking facilities. The cities of Madison, Fitchburg, Monona, and Middleton, as well as Dane County, have all partnered with MG&E to place public charging infrastructure in their parking facilities. MG&E, Alliant, and WPPI all have programs in place to support and encourage the transition to electric vehicles. Promoting EVs via websites, operating EV charging stations, and providing rebates and offering leasing opportunities for residential EV charging infrastructure, and offering managed charging programs, which allow customers to save money by scheduling their vehicle's charge for off-peak times later at night. And we'll talk about funding sources. The three big federal programs that can fund new electric vehicle charging infrastructure, three big federal programs that can fund new EV charging infrastructure were created by the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. The goal of the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure, or NEVI program, is to ensure the availability of fast charging infrastructure along key highway corridors. Wisconsin's Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Deployment, or WEVI plan, the state's implementation plan for the federal NEVI program, identifies existing fast charging stations to qualify under the program, those with at least 4 fast charging ports of at least 150 kilowatts equipped with CCS connectors, and identifies potential new fast charging locations that could be funded under the NEVI program. This WEVI plan map details potential sites for additional NEVI-funded high-speed charging infrastructure in the state. Along each corridor, only one location in each color group would be eligible for funding. The orange dot in Mount Horeb and the purple dot in Edgerton are the only eligible locations for NEVI-funded charging infrastructure in Dane County. Under the carbon reduction program, each state is awarded funding each year. A portion of that funding is allocated to large MPOs in the state to award to projects in their areas. In 2022, the MPO selected 4 projects for funding. 2 projects that would involve the installation of charging infrastructure and the purchase of electric fleet vehicles in Middleton and Sun Prairie, and 2 that would replace conventional streetlights with LEDs in Madison and Fitchburg. However, 2022 funding was delayed for a year, and prior to the 2023 application cycle, the Joint Finance Committee restricted the use of these funds, so CRP funding could no longer be used to fund the purchase of electric vehicles or the installation of EV charging infrastructure. All projects selected in the 2023 application cycle involved the conversion of streetlights to LEDs. And that leaves the Charging and Fueling Infrastructure Grant Program. The MPO partnered with the county, energy utilities, nonprofit organizations, UW-Madison, the city of Madison, and other communities in the county, including many of you, to apply for funding to install EV infrastructure in the county with a particular focus on underserved communities. The project would total nearly $19 million, about $15 million of which would be federally funded. And that application was submitted last June. The Inflation Reduction Act also included a number of programs that can be used to fund EV charging infrastructure. Of these, the Alternative Fuel Infrastructure Tax Credit is the most straightforward. It offers businesses located in rural and low-income census tracts tax credits of up to 30% of the cost of charging station installation, up to a maximum credit of $100,000. The tax credit is also available to individuals installing charging infrastructure at home, up to a maximum credit of $1,000. There are a number of other IRA programs under which EV infrastructure is eligible for grant funding. These programs tend to be less direct and more flexible, with funds directed to state and local governments or nonprofit organizations that will then provide funding to recipients. So while Dane County currently exceeds the recommended minimum number of public level 2 and level 3 charging stations, we still have some important gaps. People living in apartment buildings and houses that lack off-street parking often have no way to charge their cars at home. The tan areas shown on the map are areas with multifamily housing and no nearby public charging installations. While a small number of apartment buildings in these areas may have charging facilities available for residents, the vast majority do not. As used EVs become more widely available and more accessible to people with lower incomes, we should make sure that a lack of access to residential charging doesn't become a barrier to ownership. To serve long-distance travelers and ride-hailing and delivery drivers who often need to charge on the go, we will need additional Level 3 chargers throughout the county. Additional fast chargers will make longer trips in EVs easier, support the growing demand for fast charging from ride-hail and delivery drivers, many of whom have lower incomes, and will facilitate the transition to EVs more broadly. Secondary needs include chargers serving work sites, multimodal hubs such as park and ride lots, and other destinations where people leave their cars parked for long periods, as well as rural communities that lack charging infrastructure. Now we'll talk about the priority charging locations for Level 2 and 3. Because about 90% of EV charging takes place at home, Level 2 chargers are most needed in residential areas where people currently cannot charge their vehicles. These could be private chargers in apartment building parking lots, public charging stations, or pole-mounted chargers along the street. Level 2 chargers are also needed in employment areas where employees park for the length of their workday. These could be either private chargers located in business parking lots or public chargers in parking facilities serving commercial areas. Public chargers in these areas would provide charging access to employees who cannot charge their vehicles at home and would provide an additional charging option for shoppers. Following an analysis of travel behavior involving 123 primarily commercial land use clusters, we identified 12 priority zones for Level 3 charging infrastructure based on the number of vehicles stopping each day, the length of their trips, the length of time they were stopped in each zone, the number of vehicles passing within a quarter mile each day, and their location in the county. Level 3 charging infrastructure located in these zones would make it easier to use EVs for long-distance travel, ride-hailing, and deliveries, and would also provide additional charging capacity in rural areas. At this early stage of EV deployment, the degree to which public funding will be needed to support the expansion of the EV charging network is uncertain. Communities should stay up to speed on EV growth trends and infrastructure needs, consider adjusting local plans and regulations to facilitate or incentivize charging infrastructure installation, and build relationships with charging infrastructure developers. The MPO will issue annual updates to help communities understand how EV registrations and the charging landscape is changing over time. There are 3 changes that should be made at the state level to lower the obstacles to the EV transition. The most important of these is amending the definition of a public utility to exempt EV charging stations. This is required in order to allow charging stations that are not operated by publicly regulated utilities to charge by the amount of power supplied rather than based on the time a vehicle is plugged in. Without this change, the state will be largely cut off from federal grants that can pay for charging infrastructure. It is also an equity issue because newer, more expensive vehicles can normally draw a charge more quickly than older, cheaper models. There's legislation to make this change currently circulating in the state Senate and Assembly. Removing the ban on factory stores would enable Wisconsin residents to purchase Tesla, Rivian, and other popular EV models without leaving the state. And removing the restrictions on the use of federal carbon reduction program funding imposed by the legislature's Joint Finance Committee would make additional sources of funding available for EV infrastructure. The MPO board approved the release of the draft plan in December. We're currently in the public comment period, which ends on January 22nd. After that, the plan will go before the board again in February for final approval. You can find the draft plan under What's New on the MPO homepage, greatermadisonmpo.org, and comments can be sent to mpo@cityofmadison.com. Once the plan is adopted, we'll be working on getting it out to the communities and others who can put it to use. Thank you. I'd be happy to answer any questions you have regarding this presentation or the draft plan.
Awesome. Thank you, Bill. I'm just putting your website in the chat so it's easier for people to click on that. We've got a couple of questions in the chat and the Q&A. We'll go at those and then open it up for more questions. So if you want to put a question in either spot, the chat does work now. Apologies about that earlier. So the first question was, when you were talking about EVs, you had an average cost of $19,000 from an EV. Someone says that seems low. I don't think it was the cost of the EV. I think it was the incremental cost.
Yeah, let's see. I'm just gonna share my screen again here and we'll check this out. So.
One back.
Oh, yes.
19,000 more.
Yeah, so and that is not really the actual premium because at this time gas was very pricey and there was a big run on EVs, and also there was a shortage of I think microchips and stuff that they were using in cars, which created sort of an incentive for auto manufacturers to put their effort towards making a smaller number of more expensive cars rather than as many lower price models as they normally would. So we figure the true price premium is closer to 25%, which is generally a lot less than 19,000.
Got it. Thank you. The other question in the chat is about when the EV charging spots are designated as accessible, that in some cases that means that they can't be used by all EV drivers for charging. I don't know if you looked at that at all, Bill.
Yeah, so it looks like there is some of what I've seen on the federal sites. The U.S. Access Board, I believe, is one of the ones that puts together these guidelines for accessible spots, and it says that there's a requirement that publicly accessible or EV charging stations be accessible to people with disabilities. On the other hand, I think there's no real enforcement mechanism for this. There's not a lot of sort of specifics in sort of statutory stuff there. So it seems like the city of Madison, as I showed in that zoning requirement, they have a certain number of accessible spots that are required that ratchets up depending on how many EV chargers are required in different parking lots. But yeah, generally your accessible spot is going to be different. It's going to be a different spot than the one that's accessible to other folks because it's going to be a restricted parking space. So I think some of this may be just that legislation hasn't really caught up to show exactly how many of these accessible spots you really need to have for each number of standard spaces.
Sure, that makes sense. Then we have a question about talk a little bit more about how those mapped areas, the priority areas along the major corridors, the criteria that went into identifying them.
So there's a lot more of this, of course, in the report, but basically what we did is we drew zones around everywhere in the county that has clusters of commercial development. We stuck to the clusters because if you have a school or some other kind of one-off employment, say a business or something sitting by itself, you can see how many people are coming and going, and it's a little easier to make a decision about, do we need charging infrastructure in those places? These clusters we chose because there'd be people coming and maybe visiting different businesses, restaurants, or whatever. And so there were 123 of those clusters we did sort of an initial analysis on. And we used streetlight data for that. Streetlight is a big data provider that we were able to figure out how many cars are stopping in each zone each day, how long their trips are coming and going, how many cars are passing within a quarter mile. And then for 100 of those 123 zones, we did an additional level of analysis where we worked with Streetlight, the data provider, to give us information on dwell times. So how long cars are they're stopped inside these zones. And the 100 that we chose were the ones that had more normal type of commercial. So most of the ones that were excluded were industrial type of locations where we expected most of the people going there would be there for probably a work day or something. So all of those priority zones that we identified, and I'll move it over here so we can so you can see what I'm talking about here. Let's see. So these are places where generally you have higher numbers of, you have longer average trip distances. So that's important because if you have people on longer trips, they're less likely to be stopping at home either before or after their trip, where since 90% of EV charging is done at home, that's the vast majority of it. There's a lot of people who own EVs that hardly ever charge anywhere except at their house. So those long trips, that was sort of a proxy for people who are likely to be away from home long enough that they're going to need to charge somewhere else. So that was one factor. Another is the short dwell times. If you have people who are stopped in a place for more than an hour, certainly more than a few hours, those people are going to be served fine with level 2 charging infrastructure, and which is slower. And that level 2, those level 2 chargers cost just a tiny fraction of what a level 3 charger costs. So it's much, much easier to install. They for a lot of reasons, they're much cheaper. And so we figured places where people are stopped a small amount of time and they're on long trips, that's kind of the critical thing. But then we also factored in traffic passing nearby, that you might draw in some more business, more folks that wanted to come and charge their vehicles if you're near a high volume roadway. And then we were also thinking about the location of these places in the county. So the idea is because these priority zones reflect places where it's sort of in the public interest that we would have more charging. And so having these level 3 chargers spread out makes it easier for people in sort of in the more peripheral areas of the county and in some of the rural areas to access a level 3 charger. Right now, you can drive through the county from north to south and never come within 10 miles of a fast charger. So with chargers spread out like this a little more, it'd make it easier for people in rural areas to charge. Now, most of those people are going to charge their cars at home anyway, but it would provide more redundancy. And of course, people in rural areas tend to drive longer distances. So we had that in mind as well. But these are for public interest. There's certainly other places that would be suitable for these kind of chargers. And as I mentioned, this analysis is based on existing commercial areas only. So we're not saying these are, the absolute best places. If you've got new development going on, if there's future changes in the future that are happening, that's sort of separate from our analysis here.
Yeah, that's super helpful. And I know there's another question in the chat about how these priorities might drive funding. I want to go there, but I want to first, when I look at this map, one of the things I think is if we want to encourage more private investment in charging, these are the places where where you've shown that there is like a potentially good market for private investment. So a thing for folks to remember is in our Charge Up Dane County grant, our focus there, if we get that funding, is to really put chargers where they're not going to occur otherwise, that are of a strategic advantage. So that's why we're thinking a lot about that multifamily housing and maybe more rural areas where it's harder to convince somebody. But when I look at this map, Bill, I think, oh, there are some places where if I'm in a conversation with certain kinds of entities, there may be other fuel providers who are talking about adding EV charging to their stations. I should show them this map and go, hey, you might have a station where they can access, other funding and do that directly, where it's not necessarily local governments having to fund that, so that might check off a few of these locations that seem like, well, of course there should be something in that area, kind of thing. And here's a good partner for that. Does that?
Yes, exactly, Kathy. And I just mention for the viewers here that in the plan itself, we have tons of maps mapping pretty much each of these metrics that I've been describing. So you can see, and that show all of the zones. And then we've got tables in there where you can see which you can find your zone that you're interested in and figure out how long people are staying in that zone, what's the volume of traffic stopping in that zone, and pass through traffic and all of that.
Right. So there was a question from Kelly in Middleton about, how sustainability directors could be sort of thinking about this information. And again, I think there's like the potential to look at areas of your community and go, hey, this seems like a place that might be a good place for faster charging. And do you have local stakeholders who might have an interest in that? We're hearing that in some of the utility rate cases last year, Walmart indicated that they wanted to put fast charging at all of their locations in the next couple of years. If you've got a Walmart, that might be a good, there's some opportunity there, I think, for us to think about. And we have a ton of questions now. It's awesome, but Kathy has to like juggle between the Fish Hatchery Road is a major thoroughfare off the Beltline and carries a high level of traffic. Oh, another question popped in, and I and has numerous. Oh, so I think just noting that Fish Hatchery Road, yeah, I think, and I guess I want to encourage people to look at the analysis in the report, look at your own communities, identify if there are places you think have more potential, that, that's a reasonable comment for someone to reach out to Bill with. I guess I want to re-clarify, if we get, and folks are telling us that in this month, hopefully the U.S. Department of Transportation will announce those charging and fueling infrastructure grants that we applied for. If we apply for that grant, we will set up a stakeholder process where we'll identify where we're going to invest those funds in public charging. The MPO's work is an important foundational document for us. It gives us information we didn't have before, but we've been really clear in the application that it is a foundation document, and then we're going to look at other things. If there are priority areas here where it's clear the private market is going to step in, we are not going to step into those areas. We're trying to fill gaps. And I really, if you remember, that application has a lot more effort around level 2 charging to support rental housing and multifamily housing where folks don't have access to charging. these level 3 chargers are pretty expensive. It's a pretty small number of those we were talking about in that.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, Kathy. I mean, if I was to think about the top need, I think, is level 2 charging that serves residential areas where people currently don't have a place to park off street, or where for some other reason they can't charge their vehicles in say apartments or homes that don't have off-street parking. I think that is the biggest thing for equity and everything else. I mean, we think 90% of all EV charging is done at home. So these level 3 chargers, it does increase convenience, and certainly makes it easier for these long distance trips. But for most people, they're very rarely going to need to charge anywhere but at home.
Right. Sherry Gruder has a question about the Alliant Energy Center Expo area as a potential spot, given people are coming from long distances. Sherry, I can tell you we're having conversations about that. And yes, it is an issue at any of those places that people might stay parked in a charger after they're done charging. A lot of the charging networks have a protocol where they charge you by the minute for what they call idling in a charging spot. So I know I drive an EV, and my EV app notifies me about 5 minutes before charging is complete so that I can get my, there's like a 10-minute grace period, I think, or something, but then it will start charging me by the minute for blocking someone else's charging. So that is part of the process of, I think we will all learn new things as this market evolves, kind of thing. There were a couple of questions about the KW, the demand associated with EV charging and how that gets managed. And it seems like, Bill, that issue is probably outside the scope of what you were looking at. That's much more a utility kind of issue so I know, for example, MG&E has a pilot to incentivize EV owners for charging their vehicles, in the middle of the night when there's a lot of cheaper electricity.
Yes, yeah, and I think some of the other one or both of the other big utilities here may also be doing that same thing. Because I know when people get home from work, then there's a lot of power usage as people are making dinner and watching TV and doing everything people do when they're not working. But then once folks go to sleep, and say around midnight or so, they're in the wee hours, the price of electricity tends to go down, and there's not such a crunch. And so you can set it up so that you plug in your car when you get home, just as always, but then you go to sleep and your car is not charging until those prices start to go down and demand is dropping there.
Exactly. We call that smart charging. With that, I am going to thank everyone for being here. This was a terrific webinar. Again, if you've got comments on the plan, you should send those to the MPO as per the website. And thank you, Bill, for spending time with us today to talk about this. This is terrific, and I'm excited that this piece is moving forward. I'm hopeful we're going to hear about the CFI grant soon, and then we'll be able to talk about more next steps.
Yes, I can't wait to find out about that. So fingers crossed. Thank you, Kathy.
Yep. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Bye.